What happens when a sitting president walks into the lion's den of daytime television and makes claims that leave even his biggest supporters speechless? You're about to witness one of the most revealing political interviews in recent memory, where Joe Biden sat across from Whoopi Goldberg and the View panel, making statements that would send shockwaves through the political world. Before we dive into this explosive exchange, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop your thoughts in the comments, because this conversation is going to leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about political loyalty and media dynamics. The tension in the studio was palpable from the moment Biden took his seat. Whoopi Goldberg, known for her unwavering support of Democratic politicians, seemed prepared for what she thought would be a friendly conversation. But what unfolded was anything but predictable. Biden, appearing more defiant than many had seen him in months, immediately took control of the narrative in a way that caught everyone off guard. The first bombshell dropped when Whoopi asked about his decision to step aside from the 2024 race. Instead of the humble, gracious response many expected, Biden's answer was sharp and unapologetic. He looked directly into the camera and declared that he absolutely would have defeated Trump if he had stayed in the race, a claim that visibly stunned the panel. The silence that followed was deafening, and you could see Whoopi processing how to respond to such a bold assertion from someone who had already stepped aside. But Biden wasn't finished. He doubled down, explaining that his decision to withdraw wasn't about his capabilities or his chances of winning, but about party unity and what he believed was best for the country. The way he delivered this message, with a mixture of pride and frustration, created an immediate undercurrent of tension that would only intensify as the interview progressed. Whoopi, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, tried to steer towards safer ground, but Biden seemed determined to set the record straight on his terms. The dynamic between them began to shift noticeably when Biden started addressing what he called unfair characterizations of his presidency. His voice grew stronger, more animated, as he pushed back against narratives that had been circulating in the media. Whoopi, who had been nodding along supportively, suddenly found herself in the position of having to either challenge a sitting president or allow potentially controversial statements to go unchecked on her show. What made this moment particularly compelling was watching Whoopi's facial expressions as Biden spoke. Here was someone who had been one of his most vocal defenders, suddenly faced with a version of Biden that didn't match the narrative she had been promoting. The other co-hosts exchanged glances, clearly sensing that this interview was taking an unexpected turn. The atmosphere in the studio had transformed from what was supposed to be a friendly chat into something much more charged and unpredictable. Biden's body language told its own story. Gone was the careful, measured politician that viewers had become accustomed to seeing in recent months. Instead, he sat forward in his chair, gesturing emphatically, speaking with a conviction that seemed to catch even his longtime media allies by surprise. When Whoopi attempted to interject with what seemed like a supportive comment, Biden held up his hand, indicating he wasn't finished making his point, a gesture that created visible tension on set. The real turning point came when the conversation shifted to his relationship with the Democratic Party leadership. Biden's comments about feeling pressured to step aside were delivered with an edge that hadn't been heard in his previous public statements. He spoke about party unity, but his tone suggested frustration with how his exit from the race had been handled. Whoopi, clearly trying to maintain her role as both interviewer and supporter, found herself walking an increasingly difficult tightrope. As Biden continued to speak, it became clear that this wasn't going to be the softball interview that many political shows had become known for. The energy in the room had shifted dramatically from the opening moments, and both Biden and Whoopi seemed to realize they were in uncharted territory. The other panel members sat mostly silent, understanding that they were witnessing something significant unfold in real time. The tension reached a crescendo when Biden made reference to what he called disloyalty within his own party, statements that left Whoopi scrambling to find the right response. Her usual quick wit seemed to abandon her as she processed the implications of what was being said on her show. The camera captured every micro-expression, every uncomfortable pause, as both host and guest navigated this. What happened next would test the limits of Whoopi's legendary composure and reveal just how unprepared even seasoned television hosts can be when their guests go completely off script. The woman who had spent years defending Biden on national television suddenly found herself face to face with a version of him that didn't match the talking points she had memorized. Her attempts to regain control of the interview would only make the situation more explosive. Whoopi's first strategy was classic damage control. She tried to reframe Biden's statements in a more palatable way, suggesting that his confidence about beating Trump showed admirable leadership spirit. But Biden wasn't having it. He interrupted her mid-sentence, something that rarely happens on The View, and corrected what he called her mischaracterization of his words. The look of shock on Whoopi's face was unmistakable as she realized this wasn't going to be the easy conversation she had planned. The president leaned back in his chair and delivered what would become the most quoted line from the entire interview. He told Whoopi directly that he didn't need anyone to interpret his words for him, especially not someone who hadn't been in the rooms where the real decisions were made. The studio fell completely silent. Co-hosts Sunny Hostin and Sarah N. looked like they wanted to disappear into their chairs. Even the usually vocal Joy Behar seemed at a loss for words. Whoopi's response revealed just how rattled she was by Biden's directness. Instead of her usual quick comeback, she paused for what felt like an eternity before attempting to laugh off the tension. But her laugh came out forced and uncomfortable, and Biden didn't join in. He simply stared at her, waiting for a real response to his challenge. The power dynamic in the room had completely shifted, and everyone could feel it. The conversation took an even sharper turn when Whoopi tried to bring up Biden's cognitive abilities, clearly attempting to give him an opportunity to address the concerns that had been raised about his mental sharpness. What she got instead was a response that nobody expected. Biden didn't just defend his cognitive abilities, he went on the offensive, questioning whether the media personalities who had been spreading those narratives had the credentials to make such assessments. His words cut deep, and Whoopi knew it. She had been part of those conversations, had participated in the speculation about his fitness for office, and now she was sitting across from him, being called out directly. Her usual confidence cracked visibly as she tried to explain that her comments had come from a place of concern, not malice. Biden's response was swift and unforgiving. He told her that concern from friends looks different than what he had been experiencing from the media. The tension escalated further when Biden brought up specific instances where he felt the View had been unfair in their coverage. He mentioned segments where the panel had discussed his gaffes and questioned his decision-making abilities. Whoopi found herself in the impossible position of defending her show's editorial choices while trying to maintain some semblance of the friendly relationship they were supposed to have. What made this exchange particularly uncomfortable to watch was how personal it became. Biden wasn't just challenging Whoopi as a television host, he was questioning her as someone he had considered an ally. He spoke about feeling betrayed by people he thought were in his corner, and while he didn't mention names, everyone in the studio knew exactly who he was talking about. The camera kept cutting between Biden's intense stare and Whoopi's increasingly flustered attempts to respond. The breaking point came when Whoopi tried to interrupt Biden again, this time more forcefully, telling him that they needed to move. On two other topics, Biden's response was immediate and sharp. He told her that he would decide when he was finished making his point, not her. The audacity of a guest telling the host how the interview would proceed created a moment of television. Unlike anything viewers had seen before, Whoopi's face went through a series of expressions that revealed her internal struggle. She was clearly angry at being spoken to that way on her own show, but she also seemed to recognize that pushing back too hard could make the situation even worse. The other co-hosts remained frozen, understanding that anything they said could potentially escalate an already volatile situation. The studio audience, which had been silent throughout this exchange, began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked fascinated by the drama unfolding before them, while others seemed genuinely concerned about what they were witnessing. The producers, undoubtedly watching from the control room, must have been frantically trying to figure out how to handle what was quickly becoming a public relations disaster for both parties. Biden continued his critique of media coverage, and his words became increasingly pointed. He spoke about the responsibility that comes with having a platform and questioned whether some television personalities understood the weight of their influence. While he didn't mention Whoopi by name in this part of his commentary, his eyes never left her face, making it clear that his words were directed at her personally. The atmosphere had become so tense that even the technical crew seemed affected. Camera operators appeared uncertain about where to focus, and the usual smooth transitions between shots became awkward and delayed. It was as if everyone involved in the production was holding their breath, waiting to see how much further this confrontation would escalate. What happened next would push the boundaries of daytime television even further. Whoopi, clearly struggling to maintain her professional composure, made the mistake of trying to fact-check Biden in real time. She pulled out her phone, something that never happens during a live interview, and began referencing articles about his polling numbers before he dropped out of the race. This move backfired spectacularly, as Biden saw it as both disrespectful and dismissive of his lived experience as the actual candidate. Biden's reaction was swift and cutting. He asked Whoopi if she was really going to sit there and tell him what his own campaign internal polling showed, based on articles written by reporters who had never seen the actual data. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, and Whoopi visibly recoiled from the force of his response. She quickly put her phone away, but the damage was already done. She had shown weakness, and Biden had seized on it immediately. The president then launched into a detailed explanation of how media narratives are created and perpetuated, using Whoopi's show as a prime example. He spoke about how morning show discussions become afternoon news segments, which then become evening commentary, creating an echo chamber that bears little resemblance to reality. His analysis was so pointed and specific that it felt like he had been preparing for this moment, waiting for the right opportunity to deliver this critique. Whoopi tried desperately to regain some semblance of control by appealing to their personal relationship. She reminded Biden that she had supported him through difficult times, that she had defended his policies when others were critical. But this strategy also backfired, as Biden used it as an opportunity to discuss what he saw as conditional support from the media. He explained that true allies don't abandon ship when things get difficult, and his implication was crystal clear. The other co-hosts finally attempted to intervene, with Sunny Hostin trying to ask a question about policy to change the subject. But Biden wasn't ready to let Whoopi off the hook. He turned to Sunny and said that he would address her question, but first he wanted to finish his conversation with Whoopi. The way he emphasized the word conversation made it sound more like a confrontation, which is exactly what it had become. Biden then did something unprecedented in the history of The View. He directly challenged Whoopi's credibility as a political commentator, questioning what qualifications she had to analyze complex policy decisions or electoral strategies. He pointed out that being famous and having opinions doesn't make someone an expert, and he suggested that perhaps television personalities should be more humble about the limits of their knowledge. The personal nature of this attack left Whoopi visibly shaken. She had built her career on being the strong, opinionated voice who could hold her own with anyone. Now she was being systematically dismantled by someone she had considered an ally, and she seemed to have no effective response. Her attempts to interject became weaker and less confident as Biden continued his critique. Sarah N. made a brave attempt to defend her colleague, suggesting that diverse voices in media are important for democracy. Biden's response was immediate and devastating. He agreed that diverse voices are important, but argued that those voices should be informed and responsible, not just loud and opinionated. The implication that Whoopi was neither informed nor responsible hung in the air like a challenge. Whoopi made one last attempt to assert her authority as the host, telling Biden that they needed to respect the format of the show and move on. The moment Biden mentioned respect being a two-way street, you could see something snap in Whoopi's demeanor. The woman who had spent decades in entertainment, who had survived controversies and confrontations that would have ended other careers, suddenly looked like she had reached her breaking point. What happened next would become the most talked about moment in The View's history. A complete breakdown of the traditional host-guest dynamic that nobody saw coming. Whoopi's voice, when she finally responded, was different. Gone was any pretense of diplomatic television hosting. She leaned forward in her chair, her eyes locked on Biden's, and delivered what can only be described as a verbal knockout punch. She told him that if he wanted to talk about respect, maybe he should start by respecting the people who had supported him when nobody else would, who had defended his record when his own party was questioning his fitness for office. The studio fell into complete silence. Even the background noise from the crew seemed to stop. Biden's expression changed from confident to genuinely surprised, as if he hadn't expected Whoopi to fight back with such force. But instead of backing down, he doubled down on his criticism. And that's when the situation exploded beyond anyone's control. Biden stood up from his chair, something that never happens during a View interview. The physical movement was so unexpected that the cameras had to quickly adjust to capture what was happening. He looked down at Whoopi and told her that he didn't have to sit there and be lectured by someone who had spent more time in Hollywood than in any position of real responsibility. The dismissiveness in his tone was shocking, even for those who had been following the increasingly heated exchange. Whoopi's response was immediate and fierce. She also stood up, matching Biden's energy, and reminded him that he was a guest on her show, in her house, and if he didn't like the questions, he was free to leave. The confrontation had now become physical in terms of body language, with both participants standing and facing each other across the interview table. The other co-hosts looked terrified, unsure whether to intervene or let this unprecedented moment play out. What Biden said next would be replayed on news shows for weeks afterward. He told Whoopi that he had been in public service longer than she had been famous, that he had made decisions that affected millions of people while she was making movies and cracking jokes. The personal attack was so direct and cutting that gasps could be heard from the studio audience. This wasn't political disagreement anymore, this was personal warfare, playing out on live television. Whoopi's comeback was equally brutal. She pointed out that at least she had never been forced out of a presidential race by her own party, a line that hit Biden like a physical blow. His face reddened, and for a moment it looked like he might not be able to respond at all. The observation was so pointed and accurate that even his political opponents would later admit it was devastating in its simplicity. The turning point came when Biden made what would be seen as his fatal mistake in this confrontation. He told Whoopi that she wouldn't understand the pressures of real leadership because she had never been responsible for anything more important than television ratings. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. and it was exactly the wrong thing to say to someone who had built an empire in one of the most cutthroat industries in the world. Whoopi's response was swift and merciless. She reminded Biden that she had been successful in her career for decades, that she had built something lasting while he was sitting there as a lame duck president who had been pushed aside by his own party. She pointed out that at least when her ratings dropped, she didn't blame everyone else for her failures. The parallel she was drawing was clear and devastating. The other co-hosts finally found their voices, with Joy Behar attempting to calm the situation by suggesting they take a commercial break, but both Biden and Whoopi ignored her completely, too locked in their verbal combat to pay attention to anyone else. The producers in the control room must have been in panic mode, trying to figure out how to handle what was quickly becoming a public relations disaster for everyone involved. Biden then made his most inflammatory comment of the entire exchange. He suggested that maybe Whoopi should stick to topics she actually understood, like entertainment gossip, and leave the serious political analysis to people who had actually been in the arena. The sexist undertones of his comment were impossible to ignore, and they seemed to energize Whoopi rather than intimidate her. Her response was immediate and cutting. She told Biden that she had been analyzing politics since before his last successful campaign, and that maybe if he had listened to critics like her, instead of dismissing them, he might still be running for re-election, instead of sitting there as a failed candidate making excuses. The accuracy of her observation clearly stung, as Biden's expression showed genuine anger for the first time in the interview. The confrontation reached its crescendo when Biden, clearly losing control of his temper, told Whoopi that she had no idea what real pressure felt like, what it meant to make decisions that could affect the entire world. His voice was raised, now, something that rarely happened in his public appearances, and the raw emotion in his words revealed just how deeply her criticisms had affected him. Whoopi's final response would be the moment that ended the interview and sent shockwaves through the political world. She looked Biden directly in the eyes and told him that the only pressure he was feeling now was the pressure of knowing that history would remember him as the president who couldn't even finish the job he started. The aftermath of Whoopi's final statement hung in the air like a thunderclap. Biden, clearly stunned by the directness of her words, stood frozen for what felt like an eternity. The cameras captured every micro-expression as he processed what had just happened, the realization that this interview had spiraled completely out of his control. What came next would define not just this moment, but how both of these public figures would be remembered in the context of this explosive encounter. Biden's response was unlike anything viewers had ever seen from him in a public setting. Instead of the measured, diplomatic language that had characterized his decades in politics, he delivered what can only be described as a raw, unfiltered reaction. He told Whoopi that her comment was beneath even her usual standards, and that she had just shown everyone exactly why serious people don't take daytime television seriously. The venom in his voice was palpable, and it was clear that her words had found their target. But Whoopi wasn't finished. With the confidence of someone who knew she had already landed the decisive blow, she calmly sat back down in her chair and delivered her final assessment. She told Biden that if he couldn't handle honest criticism from a television host, maybe the American people were right to have concerns about his ability to handle the pressures of the presidency. The calculated nature of her response, delivered while Biden was still standing and visibly agitated, created a powerful visual that spoke volumes about who was really in control of this moment. The breaking point came when Biden, clearly at the end of his patience, made the decision that would dominate news cycles for weeks. He looked directly at the camera, bypassing Whoopi entirely, and addressed the audience directly. He told viewers that they had just witnessed exactly what was wrong with media today. People with platforms but no real understanding of the complexities of leadership or governance. Then, in a move that shocked everyone present, he unclipped his microphone and placed it on the table. The gesture was unmistakable. Biden was walking away from the interview, something that simply doesn't happen on shows like The View. As he moved toward the edge of the set, Whoopi called after him, asking if he was really going to storm off because he couldn't handle a tough conversation. Her question was designed to provoke, and it worked perfectly. Biden stopped, turned back toward the panel, and delivered his parting shot. He told Whoopi that he wasn't storming off. He was choosing not to waste any more time with people who confused entertainment with journalism. He suggested that maybe she should focus on what she did best, which clearly wasn't political analysis, and leave the serious conversations to serious people. With that, he walked off the set, leaving behind a stunned panel and an audience that wasn't sure whether to applaud or sit in shocked silence. The moments immediately following Biden's exit were television gold. Whoopi, clearly energized by what had just happened, turned to the camera and addressed the audience directly. She told viewers that they had just witnessed what happens when politicians are confronted with uncomfortable truths, that instead of engaging with criticism, they run away. Her analysis was sharp and immediate, showing that she understood the significance of what had just occurred. The other co-hosts finally found their voices, but their reactions revealed just how unprecedented this situation was. Sarah N. looked genuinely shaken, clearly uncertain about how to process what she had witnessed. Joy Behar, typically never at a loss for words, seemed unusually subdued, perhaps recognizing that this moment would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. Sunny Hostin attempted to provide some context, but her words felt inadequate given the magnitude of what had just transpired. What made this moment particularly significant was how it revealed the fundamental tensions between traditional political figures and modern media personalities. Biden represented the old guard, politicians who expected deference and softball questions from friendly media outlets. Whoopi represented a new breed of media figure, someone who refused to play by the traditional rules of political interview etiquette. The visual of Biden walking away while Whoopi remained composed in her chair became an instant metaphor for broader changes in American political discourse. Here was a former vice president and sitting president being outmaneuvered by a television host, not through preparation or policy knowledge, but through sheer force of personality and willingness to engage in direct confrontation. The implications of this exchange extended far beyond the immediate drama of the moment. Biden's decision to walk away from the interview would be seen by critics as evidence of his inability to handle pressure, while his supporters would argue that he was right not to dignify Whoopi's attacks with further response. The interpretation would largely depend on the viewer's existing political preferences, but the raw footage spoke for itself. Whoopi's performance in this exchange would be analyzed and debated for months afterward. She had managed to get under the skin of one of the most experienced politicians in America, forcing him into a position where he felt his only option was to leave. Whether viewers saw this as skillful journalism or unfair ambush tactics would become a matter of intense debate across social media and news programs. The broader implications of this confrontation revealed uncomfortable truths about the current state of American political discourse, the traditional boundaries between entertainment and news, between friendly interviews and adversarial journalism, had completely broken down. What viewers witnessed was two powerful personalities engaged in verbal warfare, with neither willing to back down or show weakness. As the show cut to commercial break following Biden's dramatic exit, viewers were left